I want to start by thanking the Fraternity movement for having me here. It's very hard to talk about a book like this in public because the book came out in the middle of a pandemic. It came out last year. It came out in India in February. And this is my second public event. So all the events that I've done over the year is all online. And it was incredibly hard to talk about this book because this book came out just before the second wave of the pandemic. And so much of what happened in the pandemic, the violence of the state, the way in which the most marginalized, the people who were furthest away from the power were treated, somehow felt like the borders were no longer just in the frontier, the borders were being created all over the country. So what I thought I would do today is give you an introduction to the book, read segments from the book, and perhaps give you an overview of what I want some of you to take away from. I think a good writer's job is not to preach. It's definitely not to tell you what to think, but give you some prompts to take away with. And I hope you will take some of those questions with you. Where you're born, what passport you hold, can shrink your world, cripple you, and sometimes kill you. Whether it was testimonies I have read in Rwanda, Bosnia, or stories of Iraqi, Somali, Sudanese, or Eritrean clients told me as I prepared the legal petition, what became clear was this. Political borders were unraveling across the world. We were living in the age of the great crisis of citizenship and belonging. Had we reached an impasse about how to think about citizenship, borders, and the nations that enclose them? And I think this is the most important question that the book raises, which is, what function does a nation state still perform if it has consistently failed to offer the most basic of human dignities to its people? Various democracies are crumbling within these nation states. Could we, I wondered, envision a new world, radically remade by freedom and justice? So there are two things that I really want all of you to take away from this book is first, what function does a nation state perform if it has never given most of its people the basic kind of dignity and freedom? And second, can we reimagine a different world, a different way of organizing ourselves? When I say can we think of a different world, I'm not thinking of this as an utopian exercise. I'm not thinking of this as a hunky-dory exercise where we think the future is going to be so great and utopian. No. For me, reimagining a different world is absolutely important now, because the way we are living right now cannot sustain itself. The hate, the bigotry, the fact that we consistently use law to deny justice to people, to consistently create apartheid and illegality, the way that we create hierarchies that oppress people. This is not the way to live, and this should never have been the way to live. So when I ask if can we reimagine a different world, it is not a beautiful new utopian world, it's a map of survival. This is something we have to do today, and we have to do it now. The idea of traveling along the border, various democracies are crumbling within the nation state. Could we, I wondered, envision a new world radically remade by freedom and justice? While I struggled with these questions for years, it was in Afghanistan while researching the counterinsurgency practices along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border that the ideas, stories, arguments, and images I had gathered over years came together as a plan to explore these questions back home in India. The idea of traveling along India's borders, all 9,000 miles of it, was audacious. No one had done it before. I didn't know what such a journey would entail. Having conceived of this undertaking, I became obsessed with the idea and was consumed by it. I spent the next 6 months reading everything I could. The bibliography I kept at the time had a list of 113 books, another 150 essays. But even those 6 months of research, saving money, plotting did not prepare me for the task ahead. The project that I thought would take a mere few months took over 7 years. It would have been easier to pick 10 places on the border, parachute in and describe them, and leave. That would have been the most efficient, but not the most truthful. From the farthest outposts of India to ungoverned spaces and forgotten regions, I traveled to places shaped by an array of competing histories. The physical journey opened strange doors, and the days spent waiting for permits at the border rummaging through the archives and speaking with people in their homes became an integral part of the story. Returning regularly for 7 years, I amassed endless notebooks, over 1,000 images, and more than 500 hours of over 300 hours of recorded conversations. How does one assemble these fragments into a book? The book changed in multiple ways as I traveled. I wrote, rewrote, edited, added, discarded the material. The guide I can offer to my readers is this: view it as a scrapbook assembled as an archive of personal, social, political, told through images, text, lists of other people's poetry and map. Before we talk about what's in the book, I also wanted to take this moment to talk about what is not in the book. This was a conversation that we were having before, is that in 2019 was when this manuscript was due. A lot of things happened. One, we had the Babri Masjid, the judgment on Babri Masjid. We had the revocation of Article 370 and the absolute digital siege and authoritarian ways in which internet was cut out from Kashmir. We had the CAA and the NRC, and so many other things became almost happened at the same time that many of the people in the book no longer wanted to be a part of this book. It became unsafe to have their names. For instance, this book doesn't have a Gujarat chapter. The reason the book doesn't have a Gujarat chapter is not because I didn't go there, it's because people no longer felt safe to have their stories out. Another thing was that when I started traveling in 2013 in India, India was a very different place. And by the time I finished my travel, India had transformed in ways that even those who spoke to me in early 2013 and 14 no longer felt that they wanted to be in this book. So we had to let it go. The other thing that is not in this book is maps that people draw. One of the ideas that comes over and over again in this book is that people make their own maps. Every community that I went to, that I spoke to, had a very different idea of India, or different idea of who they thought they were. Of course, the most famous ones that many of you could have seen is the Khalistan map, but there are maps of what, for instance, people in Tamil Nadu thought they would be if they seceded. There were maps in Kashmir that people thought was different. There were maps in Nagaland, Manipur. There were maps in Uttar Pradesh where people imagined their communities to be very, very different. You won't find those maps in this book because the law of this nation says that you're only allowed to print a certain kind or certain version of the map. A lot of people also asked, why isn't there an official map in this book? Because the official map that so many of us are so used to is not the map that many people love or respect. For someone in Manipur or Nagaland or even parts of Punjab and Kashmir, this map is a very violent map because this does not reflect their dreams, their aspirations, or their freedom. So the book also doesn't have maps. Another difference is that the US version of the book has 42 images. This book only has 41 images. Because the US book went to print first, and while we were putting together the India version of the book, my editor said, Suchitra, we tried to keep everybody's identity as safe and secure as possible. At one point in time, my editor said, Suchitra, this person's, you have her name, you have their village, you have how they look. Now, what happens if something happened to them? While this person had spoken to me, was okay with the chapter, we didn't know if this was safe to have their image in this book anymore. So the book also doesn't have one of those images. So this book has 41 images, while the US book has 42. The reason why I'm explaining to you what is not in the book is to understand that this book is also a function of the time that we live in. We live in a world where a comedian can be picked up for a joke he did not say. A student leader can be put in prison under sedition laws for the speech he did not give. Another student leader can be picked up for an offense that he did not commit. Some of India's most committed rights activists, thinkers, lawyers, young students can all be picked up under sedition laws and put away simply for defending the Constitution. They are the stalwarts, they are the people leading these resistance. I am a mere writer, and my book is a reflection of the time. This book is also a book of the stories that did not go into it, because this is the time that we live in. This book also went through a sedition check where they sent this book to lawyers and said, can we make sure that this book, if published, will not get into a sedition, there will not be sedition charges. And the lawyers came back and said almost every other line said, this defamation, sedition, destroying communal harmony. It's very surprising for me as a writer because everything I put in this book was fact-checked, researched. And my question was, what do we do now? And they said, oh, give more citations, give more footnotes. So the book also has a lot of footnotes and citations. And a book, a writer, a person, we're all a function of our time. So this book in so many ways is also a function of this time. Now what I'm going to do is kind of talk about the journey itself and how this journey was crafted. How does one travel through 9,000 miles of, again, we use 9,000 miles because I'd actually traveled more than 9,000 miles, but 9,000 miles felt like a number that somebody could agree with, because none of the nation states, including India, agrees on how long the border really is. Much of the border study also begins at 1947. A lot of history in India is written at 1947. And this book is also an effort to say that so much of our history doesn't begin at 1947. It began a really, really long time ago. So I'm going to continue from part of the book where we talk about the months leading up to the partition. British lawyer Cyril Radcliffe arrived in India on 8th of July 1947 to draw the borders between independent India and the newly created Pakistan. Radcliffe had never been to India and had very little knowledge of the vast continent he was tasked to partition. The maps and the census data he worked with were out of date. There was no time to get the details right, and no time to inspect. In 7 weeks it was done. The many frontiers were remade, and the territory was born. The Boundary Commission finished preparing their maps on the 12th of August, and the maps were made public on the 17th of August, 2 days after the partition. Radcliffe burnt his papers, notes, and personal copies and refused his fee of rupees 40,000 and left a broken continent with its butchered freedoms once and for all. Radcliffe, in an interview with Indian journalist Kuldeep Nair, said, "I had no alternative. The time at my disposal was so short that I could not do a better job. Given the same period, I would have done the same thing. However, if I had 2 or 3 years, I might have improved on what I did." The new map and the 2 nations were born, but the border was far from settled. But also another thing you realize is that after over 70 years, the border is still not settled. The maps we take for granted is actually not real in so many ways, because so much of India's borders is actually not finalized. On 14th of August 1947, Pakistan became free, and India declared her independence a day after. The old archival newsreels show India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, addressing his people. Everybody knows this famous speech. Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny. He began with measured eloquence. At the stroke of midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom. Nehru's speech embodied a grand ambitions of a young India and painted a picture of a nation made of men and women equally protected by law. This is something that we'll talk again about, how while the Constitution gives us equality, the question of liberty is never addressed. 300 million people who were considered less than subjects under British rule, divided for years by religion, language, class, and caste, would all be united under one book, the Revolutionary Constitution. And I say Revolutionary Constitution with a bit of salt, given to her by Baba Saheb Ambedkar, independent India's first law minister and the chairman of the drafting committee. While Nehru still declared victory, the slaughter had begun. Everyone rejoiced in the new, not everyone rejoiced in the new freedoms, not everyone lived to see its promises. An estimated number killed between March 1947 and 1948 ranged between 180,000 to 1 million. There were 3.4 million missing members of targeted minorities in 1951 census. Before India could find a voice, the screams from massacre and riots reverberated throughout the country. Dispatches from the front line read like an instruction manual for creating hell on earth. And one of the things we have to realize is that so much of what happened in partition kind of begins to replay itself, because the partition, one of the first interviews that I did when I started traveling, this young man called Ghazi says the partition is ongoing. It's alive and it's ongoing. And I think in some ways you see so much of the partition kind of play itself out now in the present, especially with the CAA and NRC. I'm going to briefly talk about how the book itself was put together and the way the journey happened. India's borders, these lines are far from perfect. Miscalculations, mistakes, cartographic confusions are foundational to the world's bloodiest property dispute. The dispute that arose from the creation of new nation-states in South Asia marked an unprecedented and disorienting rupture. This book tells some of those stories, long forgotten and erased, to interrogate the nature of our contemporary border. People whose stories I've documented have lived through displacement, economic migration, political exile, ecocide, and in some cases, extreme brutality and violence. Others lost their homes forever without physically moving. Often, when I left interviews, I would hear the family members who had been listening say, "I had never heard the story before. He or she has never told us this." If the story of human civilization is about creation and destruction of various walls, boundaries, and frontiers and fences, what story does the present map of the world tell us? In elementary school in Madras, as homework, we were told to trace the outline of India many times to memorize it. The phrase Kashmir to Kanyakumari, arbitrarily connecting the northern occupied frontier with the southernmost tip of India, was used to signify the vastness of the country and the unity of its people. When I started traveling in 2013, it seemed easy to trace the border and write about it. I started in Calcutta as my base, got permission and travel permits and visa to Bangladesh. I briefly headed to the Sundarbans to the south before making the journey up to Sikkim and then India's northern states, first Arunachal Pradesh, then curving down to Nagaland. But in 2014, my visit to Kashmir complicated the matters. Unlike the southern Bengal border, it was impossible to trace the fraught LOC or wander from one point to another. Militarization, the butchered geographies, and the minefields and the barbed wires and the bunkers made it impossible to travel along the lines of the map. I had to prepare weeks in advance, make phone calls and fix appointments. I would travel few hundred miles, crossing checkpoints after checkpoints, and still might not connect with the person I was hoping to meet, and arrive at a place I hoped to see, and not arrive at the place I was hoping to see. Kashmir was also where my grammar of dissent found political and moral clarity. In Kashmir, I stayed in the largest city, Srinagar, and made multiple trips to various border villages and hamlets, Uri, Bandipura, Keren, Mundia, and Patan, and back. I would leave Srinagar, head to the border village, and stay in the homes of those I trusted, travel shorter distances and return. The overarching surveillance in these spaces meant I couldn't stay longer. I had to move quickly and constantly, and in some villages, within hours of my arrival, the local police would be on alert. Some places like Uri, I was quickly summoned to meet the local inspector. During this time, I also started questioning my images and my photographic practice. I wondered how images might function not as document of truth, but as archives of memory, if I could mold them to fill the silences in my narrative. In 2018, I left my 18-month-old daughter to finish the last leg of the travel along the western border, before returning to the northern state of Assam to understand and document the violence of the detention camps that held people who were arbitrarily detained as foreigners. This book then is not a straightforward chronology. Instead, it's a series of encounters in towns, cities, abandoned ruins. The absence, the silence, and the ambiguity of some of the geographical locations are intended to protect the identity of those who appear in the book, uncontested spaces that they inhabit. It's not my goal to bear witness or give voice to the voiceless. Such writing have long been implicated in the history of colonial and ethnographic practices, where native informants are poised to become voices of the empire. And this is something I think we should definitely talk about, and I think it's very important. Who gets to write about India? Who are the storytellers? Who are the people who interpret India to me, to the world, and also to those? I'm not a writer by training. I'm not a journalist by training. I started my career as a lawyer and as a researcher. So writing this book also taught me that how small that pool of people is. They often come from the same caste, class, backgrounds, often children of some of India's most privileged people. Today, in terms of representation, India's newsrooms, India's writers are not diverse at all, which means that often the view of India that they present is a very distorted view. My role then, people in this book are eloquent advocates of history and their struggles. My role then, in this book's role, is to find in their articulation a critique of the nation state, its violence and its arbitrariness of territorial sovereignty. The stories in this book are a way to engage with how people live, struggle, fight, and survive. Their stories challenge us to think, to consider whether it's possible to reject the idea of freedom, dignity, and reject the idea that freedom, dignity, and self-determination require territorial sovereignty. The more I traveled along the border,
the more I realized that the books I had read were disconnected from the reality of the people I encountered. Local history and memory sometimes bore no resemblance to the political history that I knew. I had to unlearn how I wrote, but more importantly, I had to unlearn the prejudices of the privilege that I had. Meanwhile, the India I was writing about was rapidly transforming into a violent, xenophobic Hindu state, waging war against its constitution and so many of its people. An authoritarian India, deeply antagonistic to secularism, political dissent, and pluralism, emerged as I traveled and wrote this book. I was in the northern state of Rajasthan just after the Muslim folk singer Ahmad Khan was lynched in the Jaisalmer's Daltal village. Khan hailed from the Manganiyar community of Muslims who were known for folk songs in praise of Hindu deities. A Hindu priest, a local faith healer named Ramesh Sutar, hired Khan and then lynched him for not singing well. Over 40 Muslim families fled the village following the lynching. Similarly, a few weeks later, the horrible lynching of Pehlu Khan happened. So one of the things that I hope to write and record in this book was how India itself had changed between 2013 to the time that I finished the book. Tabish, a young protester I met in the 2019 protests against India's citizenship law, spoke about the fear of most young Muslims live with. He says, "We are so used to this fear, we think it's normal. I saw people circulating videos of Junaid, a 16-year-old boy, being lynched on the train. Junaid had been traveling back to his village in Haryana after shopping in Delhi for Eid in 2017. Tabish was in his ancestral village in Meerut when the news broke. A week after, when he boarded the train from Meerut to Delhi, he traveled in fear. He tells me, I shaved my week-long stubble. I kept to myself the entire journey. While violence against minorities in India has always been chronic, by 1970s, winning elections by appealing to majoritarian sentiments against Muslims and other minority communities had become a well-honed strategy. Since Prime Minister Narendra Modi came to power in 2014, Muslims have been the disproportionate victims of violence, especially lynchings. And I think it's very important for us to really understand what this regime has done. If 2014 creates the priming where you see an increase in violence, in the wake of Modi's re-election in May 2019, the government aggressively implemented policies that seek to remake India into a Hindu nation. In its first 100 days, Modi's government unconstitutionally revoked the special status of the relative autonomy in the Muslim majority state of Jammu and Kashmir, putting over 8 million Kashmiris under an unprecedented information blockade. The Unlawful Prevention Act, the UAPA, was amended to designate individuals as terrorists unilaterally, and the Right to Information Act was diluted. India's Supreme Court has essentially ruled that faith can now trump over rule of law. Hindu belief based on mythology that God Ram was born in Ayodhya can be invoked to resolve property disputes. When majoritarian beliefs become constitutional values, we retreat to the untenable ideology that this country can no longer belong to both Hindus, Muslims, and the various other religions here. On 31st August 2019, the National Register of Citizens, NRC, requiring Indians to provide evidence of their citizenship, while those regarded as foreigners would be held in detention centers, released a list of names in the state of Assam that effectively rendered 1.9 million people stateless, many of them Muslims. In response to this, Genocide Watch issued 2 alerts, first for the Indian-occupied Kashmir and later for Assam, stating that the preparation for genocide is definitely underway in India, the next stage of extermination. In November 2019, the government announced the NRC would be implemented nationwide. Then came the Citizenship Amendment Act, the coup de grace, a clear articulation of the government's effort to systematically transform India into an ethno-nationalist state, where millions would become stateless subjects stripped of rights. Passed in December 2019, the CAA is India's equivalent of the Nuremberg laws. It violates the secular principles of the Indian Constitution and introduces religion as the basis of citizenship, allowing allowing Hindus, Parsis, Jains, Buddhists, Sikhs, and Christians persecuted in Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Afghanistan to acquire citizenship, while excluding persecuted Muslim communities from the region. Ahmadis in Pakistan, Hazaras in Afghanistan, and Rohingyas in Myanmar are also excluded from seeking citizenship, as are Tibetans, Sri Lankan Tamils, Chins from Myanmar, and other vulnerable groups. The National Campaign Against Torture, a Delhi-based rights group, said that CAA made over 600,000 refugees in India forever stateless and vulnerable. I don't think many of us understand, and I think when I say many of us, I think the average middle-class Indian or the so-called middle-class Indian understands the immense violence and damage all of this has caused. When CAA was first introduced, millions of Indians across the country took to the streets. I was one of them. Students at Jamia Millia in Delhi and Aligarh Muslim University in Uttar Pradesh had begun a non-violent protest. Within days, the police stormed both the university campuses. Students who hid inside the washrooms fearing a baton charge were beaten up. Tear gas was fired inside the library, and students were dragged outside, beaten and arrested. The siege lasted for over 5 hours, and more than 100 students were wounded. Attacks on students brought more people to the street. Muslim women of varying ages, most of them from poor neighborhoods, occupied the area called Shaheen Bagh for over 3 months, braving the rain, the cold, and attacks from right-wing groups. The women of Shaheen Bagh inspired over 100 other women-led permanent sit-ins across India. Sparks of revolution were in the air. Images of B.R. Ambedkar, Gandhi, and Dalit activist Rohit Vemula appeared on the protest sites. Inqilab Zindabad, or Long Live the Revolution, once the rallying cry of Indian independence against British, was reclaimed and shouted against the Modi government. As protests progressed, so did the police brutality and the hate speech. And we all know what happened in Delhi pogrom and the violence that followed. And I think it's very important for us to realize that during the Delhi violence, on the third day of violence, over 7,000 emergency calls were made to the police control room throughout the day, and yet no one arrived. The once world's largest secular democracy, at least on paper, India is now a Hindu Rashtra, an ethno-nationalist Hindu state. Through my travels, I have attempted to trace the outline of a country that is part modern, part feudal, still struggling with democracy. By the end of my travels, I found myself with not one map of India, but many maps that looked far different from the ones I thought I knew. I taught myself to look at the fringes from the imaginary center, always looking outwards from the mainland to the faraway frontier. But when I found myself at the frontier, I realized that I was standing in a wholly different world, a wholly different history, and a wholly different country I called home. Yet in this landscape of unmarked graves, buried landmines, and cries for freedom, I began to understand that we live in a world made of borderlands, that borders are being created everywhere. While the stories from this book are from the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, India's borders, they could take place anywhere. It is not just South Asian borders that are unraveling. Borders around the world are enclosing and suffocating people rather than guaranteeing them their freedom. What happened in Bosnia was repeated in Rwanda. What happened in Palestine is happening in Kashmir. And it's not just violence and war that people are fleeing. Climate change will radically remake the borders of our world. What lines will you enforce with a standing army when water and fire have swallowed them? What sovereignty will you impose on cities erased by rising seas? Edward Said wrote that the earth is in effect one world in which empty, uninhabited spaces virtually do not exist. None of us are outside or beyond geography. None of us is completely free from the struggle over geography. The stories in this book are part of a greater universal struggle over geography, as individuals across the world navigate impositions of arbitrary border. In the words of historian Romila Thapar, borders only became borders when cartographies came into existence. Today we live in a world where commodities, capital, and drones and even surgical strikes have far greater freedom of movement than people fleeing dictators and genocide. Borders we have established in many places cannot continue to exist as they are. We shape nations out of imaginary non-existent lines, sometimes amputating communities and old cultures to make way for a country. And we defend these lines with violence lest they cease to exist altogether. As the need to rethink the shape of the post-colonial world intensifies, the world contemplates a future of democracy and the nation-state in contested terrain. The stories from borderlands need to be told. The real histories are intricate, contradictory, and full of inconvenient truths that cannot be neatly sorted into textbook categories of cause and effect. They hold immense pain, but they also reveal a glimpse of a new world.
I think now we can have the questions. So I have some questions, and then we can take the question from audience. So in the beginning of the book, you talk about the question of belonging. So through the story of a refugee, Ismail, with the Museum of Forgotten Stories about his city and his country that no longer exist. So, and you also talk about your personal experience as in when you were an Indian citizen in a foreign country. So, can you elaborate a little on this question of belonging, and also have your personal experiences, have they inspired for you to start embark on this journey?
Sure. Thank you for that question. I think belonging is something that we are all consciously thinking. I think in my case, it started subconsciously a very long time ago. I come from a family in which my parents come from different castes, different class, they speak different languages. And I grew up as a child in 80s and 90s Madras, where intercaste, interfaith, parents who speak different languages, those things, while were happening, were still not the norm. So I think somewhere along the line, I always realized that I was different. Perhaps my difference was also accentuated by the fact that I went to a school which was predominantly made of students of a very particular group. But I think the real sense of being the other, because in India, despite this one aspect, I am still the beneficiary of the Indian state. My parents were both educated, I am English speaking. The Indian state is built for the so-called, of course Rukmini would now say that there is no Indian middle class, but what we consider as the Indian middle class. It was only when I left India that I realized that I was no longer on the top of the hierarchy. I was 17 when 9/11 happened, and 2 weeks after 9/11, I left Madras to go to England to study. And I went to study in England. And for the first time, I was no longer on the top of the hierarchy. I was the brown body. Second thing, many of us born, many of us who came of age in the years after 9/11, especially if you were outside of India, I saw so many of my Muslim friends go through some of the most dehumanizing things. Whether it was just the way in which it was treated. I don't think we remember so much of what we see happening in India right now happened in places in Europe, it happened in the US, where you consistently saw so many of my friends going through all of this. Even as I started working my own work, whether it was a work in the Tribunal for Yugoslavia or Rwanda, or the work I did with refugees in Cairo as a lawyer, consistently you saw the greatest crisis was two things: the crisis of citizenship and the crisis of belonging. And I think all of those experiences somehow, I don't think it prepared me, but I think it kind of gave me the grounding or the moorings to understand that this is something that was important to think about and write about.
Okay, so in your book you look at the maps as a product of, as a tool of colonial imperialism. So how has this journey changed your perceptions regarding the map, the borders?
I think it's what I've said before, is that I think for many of us, let me put it this way. The first time I saw Kashmir in my imagination was the film Roja by Mani Ratnam. I think I was 9 or 10 when the film came out. In my head, that's what I thought Kashmir looked like, till I actually went to Kashmir and I saw a very different reality. That was true of Palestine, that was true of Afghanistan. I think the biggest disconnect is that there's a very consistent media manufacturing of how we think of the borders and frontiers. That is true of the US-Mexico border, that's true of all of our borders. So maps have always been, maps make an unequal world. maps, borders, create hierarchies and differences. And they've always been a tool of colonial oppression. Today, what does manufacturing statelessness do? Assuming that we make 1.9 million people in Assam stateless, what does it then do? You can't send them somewhere else. You can't put them, all of them, in detention centers. What you're doing is you're stripping them of citizenship rights and you're making them the world's underclass. And what do we then do with the world's underclass? They then become the extractable labor. So this is not just the borders we're thinking about. I think we have to think about this in terms of longer history of colonial empires, how slavery was created. The idea of all of this ties back to consistently creating and maintaining an unequal world. And once you actually travel to these borderlands, you realize that these people are actually consistently resisting that. While it's harder for them to resist, that they're consistently resisting that.
So you have talked about how you have questioned the very existence of nation state. You've talked about how the nation state is not performing the basic functions. So do you have an idea of a post-nation state? What do you think about a post-nation state? How would it be?
I think the post-nation is already here. I think the pandemic in some ways created the post-nation. And also I think it's very important for us to understand that these conversations are not new. There is a remarkable book by Gary Wilder called Freedom Time. In Freedom Time, Gary Wilder chronicles the conversations between Césaire and Senghor, two post-colonial West African leaders, poets and thinkers. Césaire and Senghor are having the exact same conversation. They're saying, can we have freedom outside the ideas of nationalism? They're asking the question, when the colonizer leaves, are we going to inherit the same nation states that they have created, that are violent, that are xenophobic, or are we going to create something else? In India, Tagore is having these conversations. A lot of vernacular conversations are happening in all the colonial nations that are fighting for resistance. Fanon is talking about this. Lenin is talking about this. Everybody is asking, is the nation state the way for us to organize ourselves? So first I think we should not forget that conversation that is much longer than 120 years or 150 years. Second, I think when you see places, I think the post-nation is already here. You saw this in places like Rojava, where after the Syrian revolution and the ISIS taking over, a local community came together to say that we are going to create a new community. Run by women, everybody is equal, it's egalitarian. For 2.5 years to 3 years, they were able to run this. The same thing happened in Seattle 2 years ago, when a bunch of people took the Seattle Autonomous Area, the Hill, and said, this is a Seattle Autonomous Area, we are going to hold this and we are going to take care of it. In Jackson, Mississippi, there is the community run by a bunch of black socialists who say that the state has retreated from this place. The state has plundered us. So we are going to figure out how to live. So it's a community where they do their own farming, they're figuring out how do we build our community. My very dear friend Asim Rafiqi did his research, his graduate research on this. And it's very interesting where they said, Asim, you can't come hang out with us because we just need a day for just us. You saw this in New York, we saw this with pandemic where the government had failed, but local communities had come together to take care of each other. You saw this in India where people were screaming and crying for oxygen. Who came together was the community that was coming together. This happened in the Chennai floods when you saw communities coming together. So communities are already organizing outside, and they've always done that. And I think the pandemic in some ways has already shifted the ways in which we think of what the state is doing. Today, those taking care of each other is not the state. People are already taking care of each other. And I think the post-nation is already here with climate change, with COVID, again, COVID is not the end. I think the pandemic era is going to last at least another 5 years. If not COVID, we'll have something else. We are in a world where all of that will fundamentally destroy the nation-state structure and something else will come out of it. The choice then is, are we going to let someone else decide for us what this world is going to be, or are we already going to be taking control of this is how this world is going to be because we are going to remake it?
Talking about the history of borders, be the partition of India or any other the borders of India. So when these were created, when the maps were drawn, people's lives, their families were all considered insignificant. Like the families that were divided in Kashmir or the Pashtun tribe that you talk about in your book. So why was this, so these people's lives, their families, their properties, these are all considered as collateral damage. When the state is doing something, these are collateral damage. So why was it easy to actually consider these people? What made it so easy, or why is their struggles so normal? So why do you think it is easy for?
I mean, it's empire. It's colonialism. It's colony, you know. It's the empires that colonized us. It colonized all of us. It took away from us so much. You know, it's very interesting. I remember going to London for the first time, and I was in so much. I was like, I looked at this place and I thought, this place looks so underwhelming. And then I also thought that this is money. This is resources that came from my region. I remember realizing, I remember seeing this over and over again. If you go to Lisbon, Lisbon is very different because all of Lisbon, you know, every time you go to a church, every time you go to a museum, they will say this was built after the plunder of this village in Goa. You know, there's actually a board that will tell you that this is how they plundered us. And if you go to Yale, you'll realize that Yale University was built from the money that was stolen from the presidency of Madras. If you go to Brooklyn, you will see that all of the great townhouses were built from the opium money from Calcutta. If you go to France, you will see things plundered from Senegal. So the entire world that we live in today is based on the plunder of vast majority of us for the benefit of the few. What transfer of power did was it was literally transfer of power. We don't call it freedom documents, we call it the transfer of power documents. The white sahibs left and the brown sahibs took over, for whom vast majority of people, their lives, their histories, their freedom, their dignity never made any sense. And that's why we are still struggling with the borders of the empires left behind. The division of Palestine, how was Palestine created? How was Kashmir created? How all of this goes back to the plunder of the vast majority of people for the benefit of the few. Today, the plunderer, the oppressor's skin color might have changed, but essentially I think we are all extractable. Before, if they took our land, they took our resources, they took our dignity. Today, they're taking our attention. Right? Today, attention is the eyeball, right? Attention is our attention on Instagram, on Twitter, on serials, on television, of Goswami shouting. Today, they are mining our data. So we've always been people who have been mined for the benefit of the large. So I don't see much having changed. I think the way in which this is extracted is changed, but everything else is the same. So, yeah.
So connecting to the same question, there is an over-romanticization of all these places, as in the border places. If it is Kashmir or Nagaland or Arunachal Pradesh, there is a marketing of its beauty and its culture, even the people, their lifestyle, but conveniently excluding the violence inflicted on these people. So again, why is it so easy to actually ignore the violence that is inflicted on these people? At the same time, we are romanticizing these places. Why is it so normal for us, for people like people in the mainland, not the government, people in the mainland, to romanticize these places, at the same time conveniently ignore the amount of violence that is inflicted on these people?
There's a brilliant book called, I think it's by Ananya Jahanara Kabir, about the landscapes of desire. There's another stunning book by Mridu Rai called Hindu Rulers and Muslim Subjects. There's a very interesting line in that book where she says how since the Mughal army first marched into Kashmir, Kashmiris have been dissenting. And she writes about the Mughal miniature paintings where the Mughal miniature paintings actually create the gardens and water gardens. And she talks about how the Kashmiris say even the Mughal miniature paintings, Kashmiris were taken away. The landscape, so what Mridurai says is that Kashmiris have looked at various people as occupiers who have always loved Kashmir, the landscape, but not as people. You love the landscape of Kashmir, but you don't want Kashmiris there. You love the landscape of a place, but you don't want them. Also, I think we have done this consistently as a part of the visual narrative. Nowhere does the Indian state spend more money than the controlling the narrative of what it means to depict these spaces. Kashmir, of course, comes. You also see this happening with India's other frontiers. I don't want to call it the Northeast because I don't think Northeast, the word does justice. If you look at Nagaland, Manipur, Meghalaya, Arunachal Pradesh, it's often called the dark frontier. You talk about the richness, the lushness, the people are always described as savages. What you're constantly doing is you are exoticizing the landscape and its people. Because once you exoticize a place, it feels almost too childlike. That needs to be protected. The beauty needs to be protected, but we are the ones to do it. You see this happening over and over and over again. But that is what a settler colonial state does. It's a landscape of desire. You want the land minus the people, right? And I think this is also something that links also back to the idea of the Hindu Rashtra, is that the Rashtra not only wants all its minorities, your Dalit Bahujans, to become the othered. There can only be one kind of a Hindu. There can only be one kind of a language. There can only be one of everything, which means that everything has to be sanitized. You want my land, but you don't want the people. Not that we also don't ask if the people want to be part of this union. That's also another big question. Now, linking this to the present, the National Population Register is going to happen. In that sense, what's going to happen is that states that have done well with indicators of health, education, are all going to get lesser ministers, while states in the north like UP and others are going to have a bigger representation of people because of the number of people. So again, what you see is there's a different way of disenfranchising certain states, certain groups of people from having a say in what is federalism. I'm not saying both of them are same, but I'm thinking it's the same thing, right? You want the resources, you want the labor, you want the people. You don't want the people, you just want the resources, but you don't want the people. So this is something that has been consistent. And again, this is not new to the Indian state. All nations do this, including colonial ones and imperial ones.
In your book, you talk about these people who lives in the borders. They confront their regular confrontations to violence, and that has changed their perceptions of justice. So for them, documenting their death or maybe documenting their lives is justice. So it is very different from what justice really is. So when a violence happened, what these people want is the bare minimum. They just want the documents of the death, who all have, they just need the names or maybe a news. So what does this speak of, the justice system of this country? Also, how do we address this as people from the mainland, as they call it? So how do we address this?
We can't address this. We can't address this. I think we have to acknowledge that while India was able to produce a constitution under, Dr. Ambedkar, an important document that gave us rights, right? But the secularism question, the question of equality, thanks to Ambedkar, we talk about the question of equality, but we don't talk about the question of liberty. Even Ambedkar himself was not finally happy with the constitution that was produced. And there's a wonderful analysis that Gyan Prakash does in his book on emergency, where he says that the emergency that happened under Indira Gandhi is not an aberration. And what we are seeing today is not an aberration. That the cores of fascism
The cause of injustice and inequality was already in the founding document. Our constitution, by its very nature, is fascist. It gives individuals far more power to decide for the rest. Why is the current dispensation able to do so much without actually declaring an emergency? I think we have to perceive, and I think this is where it goes back to the idea that we have, when I say we have to radically reimagine a new world, that does not mean a return to the status quo. We have to reimagine a different constitution, a different way of living. I do not know who will be part of that constitution the way this country is going, but what will that constitution entail? Today we have anti-conversion laws. Today we have systems in which judges, Arnab Goswami can see the Supreme Court judges will open the gates for him on the middle of the night, but Omar Khalid and Sharjeel and so many others are still in prison. Anand Teltumde is in prison. Shoma Sen, Shudha Bharadwaj, Rona Wilson. So many others that we do not know are in prison. Why? How can a nation that creates ASFA, UAPA, and consistently silences its voices of the people be a constitution that can also be a solution? And I think we need to start questioning the constitution itself, not as a way of saying this constitution is bad, but saying that we need something better. So if we are to imagine justice, then it's not going to come from the current institution, its justices, definitely not from the constitution and the institution as we have it today. It has to be something else. And I think that's why something like Shaheen Bagh was so important, because people were saying that my rights are rights because I am here. The constitution was an important part of it, but they were also saying I am here, and because I am here, I have rights. The constitution backs it up. The constitution tells me, yes, this is correct, but eventually the philosophy was that I am here. You cannot take me away. And I think that's what we need. India needs, or the subcontinent needs, a new movement for self-respect. It needs a new movement to figure out what we want. So this constitution is not going to give us justice. I know this would upset a lot of people, but I don't think this constitution can give us justice.
So you have traveled these places. So can you talk about the impunity of military in these places, the relationship of people living in these lands and the military? Also, there are these terms used to define these places as contentious, as conflict regions. So how does, we know the military is granted an impunity in these places. So how does these terms justify the actions of military, or at least help justify these the actions of military?
I think there's a long history of military impunity in South Asia, especially in India. While the Indian military doesn't come, at least on paper, we are not a dictatorship. We still have a difference between military, civil society, government, and the executive. That has already started eroding. It has eroded quite significantly, and I would say it started with the early 1990s. Second, ASFA was implemented soon after India becomes a republic. So there's a long history of this violence. There are instances in the book that go back to 60 years. There's a story from the Nagaland chapter where this woman is talking about an incredible act of violence that happens to her by the Indian army. Kunan Pushpura exists today. We know that. We know the cases of what happened in Kashmir, in Manipur, in Punjab. We know what the Indian army did in Sri Lanka. We know what the army is in. What I'm trying to say is that this question of impunity is fundamental to holding of the republic, and this is long. It also has a long documentational history. Almost all of these areas in which we've had right to life suspended, where we have ASFA, there's also a rich material archive that documents the impunity. So there is proof, there is fact, there is evidence, but nothing has been done. And ASFA makes it very clear that we can't do it. So that is one part of it.
Now, the contentious aspect of it and all of that becomes a justification, right? India's biggest claim in the world stage has been that India is democratic, we are secular, we are different. And a part of that is also often trying to say that all of these mistakes are an aberration. That every time something wrong happens, India is a robust, functional democracy, and this is an aberration. Gujarat happens, and for the first time, I think, with Gujarat in early 2000, you see a kind of international censure. And even then, the justification is, listen, this is, and that is, I think, for the first time when the Indian government really starts to figure out that media is important, controlling the media is important. And that narrative that India is secular, it's democratic, everything else that happens, Gujarat is an aberration, Godhra is an aberration, Kashmir is an aberration. That narrative is very important. And how do you constantly craft that narrative? You craft the narrative by using the language of contentious. What is really interesting is, I don't know how many of you remember, a few years ago there were a community of people who were fighting or protesting against a sterilite mine in Tamil Nadu, in Thoothukudi. And what's very, very scary is that you saw a sniper. So Section 144 was issued. Again, you can't issue Section 144 for a protest. That's just, you can't do it. They issued Section 144, and then you saw a sniper stand on top of a bus and shooting people who were protesting. 17 people were killed. And very quickly, people start saying, oh, this is becoming Kashmir, this is becoming... No, it is not Kashmir. This is how the Indian state has always behaved. So I think it's very important for us to very clearly say that this is not an aberration, this is not an exception. And words like contentious, rebellious, dissent, anti-national, secular, urban naxal, the long list is long, right? What do all these words do? The words themselves don't have any meaning. When you say contentious, what does contentious mean? What does the word anti-national mean? What does the word secular mean? What does the word urban? None of these words have analytical value of themselves. But once you put it out, the word starts gaining its own momentum and also its own defense. And I think that's how you consistently keep crafting the narrative.
Now coming to the question of citizenship. So you have observed the citizenship crisis in Assam as the largest crisis of manufactured statelessness in the human history. So now that laws like CAA is in place, so what happens when this is extended to the rest of the country, and where does it put the already vulnerable Muslims of this country, and how do we resist it?
This is not new. And I think it's very important for us to understand and repeat it over and over again that stripping people of their capacity to demand rights is what every authoritarian fascist regime has done. We saw it in fascist Italy, we saw it in Nazi Germany, we saw it in Stalinist Russia, we saw it in Rwanda, we saw it in Yugoslavia. And we saw it in Myanmar. I think Myanmar is a very good example of how the Rohingya community was consistently stripped of rights. They start by putting an arbitrary date and saying that, so communities that always had citizenship, so in the 80s they bring in a law that says, look, you have to prove that you were in this country on 1893. How does one produce a document from 150 years ago that proves that your family was here? Especially in this region of mixed ethnicities, ancestries, migrations. Then they systematically start refusing to give people ID cards. There are no ID cards which gives them anything. The only thing that Rohingyas now have, every year the government does a list, a household list, where they go to every house and they make a list of who is there and who is not. That is the only list. Second, they have to pay a tax to get married, a tax to put a roof.
most of the people in the prisons in Rakhine state are in prison because they couldn't pay the tax to get married. And then you start consistently creating local communities and telling them that you are like this because they took away your land. You weaponize the most vulnerable in the other community to kill off the others. You send in your military every few weeks, every few months, every few years to just make sure that you create a little massacre just to let them know that you can come back anytime. We've seen this happen. And today the same playbook is being used in India for many, many communities. You see it with the churches, now you see it with Muslim communities. It started with the lynching. Today we are literally auctioning women on platforms. But didn't start today. They started this when Ramayana started playing in Doordarshan as a way of priming. This started with the Rath Yatra. They are not going to stop till they want a final solution. Now the question is, we know what they're going to do. Some of us have been writing about this since 2011. In 2013, when I wrote an essay about this, I was told, Suchitra, they said you're being a drama queen. This is not going to happen in India because India is a secular democracy. Because India is secular, Modi and his government will be moderated. Power. Ashutosh Varshni, the professor Ashutosh Varshni actually says this. He says Modi will be moderated by his position. Some of the most powerful, most educated people in this country defended a regime that had come on the blood of the very communities that they had killed. So this, we know what is going to happen. Now, resistance is not going to come from political parties. They are useless. Resistance is going to come when we go to the street. We saw that happening with Shaheen Bagh. We saw that happening with the farmers' protest. We need to be on the street. Of course, COVID makes it incredibly difficult. It also puts immense pressure on communities that are already fighting against everyday dehumanization. But it is not the job of the Muslims or the Bahujans or the Christians or the Dalit Adivasi communities of the country to always take the street. It's also my job to be on the street. But we have to be on the street. The political parties will not save you. The Supreme Court of India will not save you. What will save you are the students on the street. The student movements have always been the most powerful way to change societies. So what we do is we get on the street. I think without getting on the street and protesting, what we have ahead of us is an incredibly difficult and a very painful and a violent few years. That's what is awaiting us.
We're very used to seeing images of these spectacular violence against people in these regions. So discussions on their mental health or the emotional mental trauma they go through, it's actually impossible because we have dehumanized them to an extent where we start believing that this is normal for them. So can you talk about the mental health crisis, because there are several chapters in your book where you discuss the mental health crisis of these people. So can you talk about the trauma that these people go through?
I'm not a mental health professional, so I don't know how qualified I am to speak about mental health in those terms. But one thing that I consistently saw is that I think the chapter that really kind of speaks about the generational trauma in a very straightforward way is the last chapter, with me and Natasha having the conversation. For those of you who haven't read the book, Natasha is a friend of mine in New York, but she's from Lahore. Natasha has her own son who's works with the UN. You know, in reality, if you look at her life is great. You know, she's smart, wonderful, intelligent woman, has a lovely family, and in her 30s, she finds out that her great grandfather was killed in Jallianwala Bagh, and Natasha is really not sure why this information was never told to her. And Natasha's family history is also very interesting because they're Kashmiris
who migrated from Kashmir to Amritsar, and Amritsar becomes their home, and her great-great-grandfather, who's a not a doctor, he's a healer, is killed in Jallianwala Bagh. And the moment of his death, you realize that the women in the family become not only orphaned, but they are caught in the turmoil. And of course, the partition happens, the family moves. And that one act of violence, followed by the partition, the move, completely changes the women in the family. I don't want to go into what happens to them, but, and now after years, now that Natasha is speaking about this also becomes the story of what happened to those who left India and go to Pakistan. It becomes the story of 5 generations of women about the act of violence in Jallianwala Bagh, the act of partition, moving to Lahore, Pakistan becoming an authoritarian state, how the women in the family react. And Natasha says, so many times I wondered, why is it that these women didn't do these things? And all of a sudden, all of the bad decisions, the cowardice, the lies that people tell, all of it makes sense because she realized how they are being shaped. There's an incredible paragraph in the book where another friend, Fawzia, says, she says, Suchitra, nobody should live through an authoritarian regime because we live through an authoritarian regime. Once you pack your bags and move, no matter how safe you are, where you are, there's a metaphorical, imaginary suitcase always packed and in your living room. There's always that suitcase because you never know when you will have to move again. And then you realize that we all do that. And now that I'm older, I talk to my mom and I kind of figure out things that I didn't know that happened in my family, and I realize how people react. Trauma, violence, being deprived of your home, being deprived of your dignity affects you in so many ways, and I think we are all children of the trauma. We've all inherited so much of violence that our ancestors have gone through. And it's impossible for us. Sometimes I'm surprised how the women in the subcontinent get up every day and walk, because it's a miracle. And I think that's what you see in all of these stories. Not just Natasha's story, you see it in Hilal's story, where the parents don't even know why their son disappeared, why he was killed, and how he was killed. Everybody tells them a different story. The army tells them a different story, the police tells them a different story, the men who are accused of killing their son tells them a different story, and now they have to live in the same village and still confront the military, the army, the police, and the men who killed their son. You see it with Sari Begum, where child of rape, of partition, who then says, you know, when I ask her about the border, she says, everything horrible that happened to me happened in this village. So yes, I think we forget that 17.8 million people moved homes, lost their homes. This was Holocaust in the subcontinent, and we are all children of that Holocaust. How will trauma not affect us? And I think, as I said, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a mental health professional. What I am is a writer, and then what I see is that trauma is there, and a lot of the trauma is now also being weaponized for ideological ends.
So I think we are done with the questions here, so we can take questions from the audience now.
It's nice to meet you, and it's a pleasure to be hearing straight from you regarding the book, which is so much fun, I think. So if I'm not wrong, you talked about your research regarding detention centers in Assam, right? So can you talk a little bit more about that?
What part of that do you want me to talk about? There's a lot to talk about. Also, I want to say that color green is my daughter's favorite color. She just got it dressed, and then I saw that it's a very pretty color. So you need to tell me, I'm sorry, the mother in me kicked in. But yeah, what about the detention centers? Because there is a lot that's happening.
Your experience in visiting them.
Okay, so right now, the existing prison systems, the main prisons in Assam are being used as detention centers. This is in addition to the new detention centers that they're building. So when you look at the existing detention centers, there is no difference So the detention center used to keep your prisoners, also the same detention that they're using to detain people who are considered declared or as foreigners, as doubtful voters. So in addition to that, they're also building a lot of detention centers. There's a proliferation of detention centers. And when I was traveling in 2017, the detention centers in the NRC was not a story yet. At least it was a story in Assam, but it was not a story outside. And what's interesting is that there's a chapter called Tale of Three Detentions that talks about three different people who were detained in Guwahati. One, of course, is Amir Akeem, who, when I met him, was 30 years old, has been in prison since he was 18 he's a refugee who crosses into India, and he's picked up and he's just been in prison because the offense of crossing a border is only a few months, but he's just been held. Second is Rashminara Begum, who was again from the village of Krishnai, who was called as a doubtful voter, and her family spent a lot of money to prove that she's a citizen, but despite hiring a lawyer, giving them all the documentation, the lawyer doesn't tell them exactly what happened, and one fine day when she's 4 months pregnant, she goes to the tribunal to figure out what happens to her case, and only that moment she figures out that she's been declared a foreigner, and she's arrested. She's held in detention. They move to the High Court. The High Court says, oh, she's pregnant, so just take care of her. And finally, she gives birth, still being under detention. And finally, the Supreme Court of India moves and gives her a bail. And she's still in a limbo. It's still not been proved. The courts have not said, they've not reversed the decision. And the reason she was held was because so another thing that you see happening in a lot of these instances is that many of the people who do not have documentation have lost their documentation because of two reasons. One, many of these communities live under severe climate change crisis, which means that the floods regularly flood their communities. Second is because of the many localized violences. Many Muslim communities regularly move because of various violences that have happened in Assam since the Nellie massacre. In her case, an old high school went underwater, and the family again moved, and then she married and she moved somewhere else. So while she doesn't have a school leaving certificate, which is now closed, the school doesn't exist anymore, she still has other official documents. But in different documents, her age is in one place it's 30, in another it's 32, another 33. All of this could have been easily rectified if the judge simply looked at the various documents and sometimes realizes that even official documents can have mistakes. So in Rashminara's case, young Nafisa was born. I think Nafisa is now almost 5 years old. She's still on bail, but any minute she can be reversed. The third story is the most painful of all because they picked up a woman who was 26 years old instead of picking up somebody else who was 46 years old because their names were kind of similar. So they go into a house in the middle of the night, put a gun to her husband's head, grab her and take her away. Mistaken identity. And the family then spends the next 18 months without any money trying to prove, and they have all the documentation. Despite all of this, she is still held, and then finally she's released. Because the family has now gone into debt, the husband then had to go away to another state and now work, and he hasn't been back for 6 months. What is very interesting in this case is that people in this village had already started working in the detention camps that were being built. And there's a very interesting way in which the chapter ends, is that someone actually says, what do you think they're going to do with all of us? And then somebody said, no, they're going to throw us in the detention center. And somebody says, oh, we are building these detention centers where we are going to be detained. And then, somebody else from the crowd then yells saying, no, they're not going to put us in the detention center. Are you stupid? We are cheaper dead than alive. So what these three stories tell you is that the experience of navigating the foreigners tribunal, being a doubtful voter, is painful. All of these foreigner tribunals are now run by, so the foreigners tribunals cannot give a judgment, can only give an opinion.
Yet an opinion of it for a tribunal can completely reverse the life of someone else. Second thing you realize is that many of these judges, the more people you declare as doubtful or as foreigner, you get a better assessment and your contract gets extended. So all of these judges who are in these tribunals, who are declaring people as illegal or foreigner or doubtful voters, all have an incentive to declare as many people as doubtful and as foreigner, because of that they then get, so it's like if you declare 10 people as foreigners, then it's a good assessment. Based on this, they will extend your. So what you really see is administrative, legal, moral, ethical misdemeanors that is consistently done at the cost of the people who are most vulnerable. In Assam, you also have to understand that it is not just the Muslim community that is being marginalized. You also see landless Dalits, especially Hindu landless Dalits, who get penalized. The more money you have, it's easier for you to get out of the doubtful voters list. The less money you have, if you're landless, it becomes difficult. So in any detention center, I saw, in the book I say it's like the United Nations of underdogs. You had Nepalis, you had Pakistanis, you had people from the Kachin tribe, you had all kinds of people who were now in India's detention centers because they were considered doubtful voters. I don't know if that was enough. Again, this is still the tip of the iceberg. I don't even think, I think one of the most stellar pieces of long form reporting was done by Praveen Donti when he was still writing for Caravan on the NRC. I think that is another thing that I would urge everybody to read, because it tells you it's not inhumanity. I don't think there is a word in the English dictionary that actually can describe what is happening. That's why I call this the largest manufacturing of statelessness. Of course, this is just, as I said, this is a tip of the iceberg, and there's much, much, much that is happening. I haven't been back to Assam since 2019, so I don't know what's happened to that. In the book, we also have a list. It's called Death by Citizenship. So till the book went to print, I tried to get the list of all the people who had died in the prison waiting for, it's right in the middle of the book. That's the number that we have till 2019. After 2019, you had the protests and then COVID happened. We don't have the right numbers. So that's where we are.
Hi, again, it's an honor to be part of the program and listen to you. In the beginning of the book, you've mentioned how the British Parliament has restricted Indians from voting. And the reason given was that they are somehow incapable of self-governance, or they're not ready yet. So when we think about that particular reason, it is exactly the similar as that given by, or keep raising by, most of the authoritative dictators or the government in today, while restricting certain groups of people from even being on a territory, and also from taking part in the governance, whether it be in Kashmir, that the most commonly raised justification against the military violence is that the Kashmiris have to be tamed somehow. They have to be controlled or constantly monitored, because they have the potentiality to become terrorists quickly. Or as you mentioned in regarding the Rohingya Muslims, or as the argument put forward by Chinese government against the Uyghur Muslims, is that they have to undergo a transformation cycle to be qualified enough to be part of the modern society. Or in the case of Palestinians itself, they aren't qualified enough to be part of the liberal values. So what I want to ask is, it has turned into, a transition has occurred that in our time, the rest of the world also tend to believe in the same argument, or they tend to accept that the reason has gained wide popularity among the rest of the world, that it is okay, their absence, or the absence of these particular groups, are in fact benefiting the modern liberal society. So how do you think this particular argument and its wide popularity has made it easier for the ethnic cleansing of these particular groups and sectors?
This is not a new argument, right? It's surprising to see that the same arguments were used in apartheid South Africa, right? Same arguments are used against Palestinians now. For the longest of times, the same arguments were used for disenfranchisement and refusing African Americans to have the right to vote. Same reason given for the women as a right to vote. For the longest of time, they said only men with property can vote. If you look at the history of power, I'm not talking the history of governance, so any history of power, power will always try to exclude, right? Power survives on acquisition of power by exclusion of as many people who can have access to power. That's why when you read Federalist Papers, there's a very interesting line where they say for the first time in, well, yes, while these were, again, it's interesting because they say we have to expand the pie, right? We say that America is about expanding the pie. Of course, they want to expand the pie for slave-owning white men, but it's an interesting argument because historically, monarchy or any kind of power, then of course dictatorship, now democracy, all power would want to exclude. Whether it's the empire, whether it's a nation state, whether it's a democracy, an autocracy, exclusion is the standard. How do you justify exclusions when those excluding are not an empire or an authoritarian regime, not a fascist regime, you're not a dictatorship? How do you justify excluding people? You tell them that these people cannot govern themselves. They are savages. The logic of civilizing the savage is also not new. So in my mind, none of this is new. I think each generation fights its own battles. It's not that the fight against slavery or the Emancipation Proclamation stopped slavery. After that, you had the Jim Crow. You had people consistently fighting. Now you have the BLM movement. Every generation is trying to fight against a power that still hasn't given them equal rights, maybe on paper, either equal rights, equal dignity, or freedom. And that is human history. Tomorrow they will do this to someone else. Tomorrow, it's not, victims can become perpetrators. Oppressors or those who survived the Holocaust can now go on and commit immense acts of violence against the Palestinians. And that's always been the case. So I would see of this not so much as a justification, but I would see our roles as a role of consistently fighting against it. They're still going to do that. Demonizing a group. Today, lynching, auctioning women on apps, what is all of that? It is a form of dehumanization, but this is not new, right? Unveiling the Muslim women in many of the occupied spaces is not new. Either unveiling them or covering the one that has to. In some parts of the world, colonized bodies of women had to be unveiled because they were covered. In other parts of the world, the women who were covered, women who were not covered then had to be covered because that was puritanical morality. So why is that? Because it also means that they think that they have access to the bodies of people that they can dehumanize and colonize. It's not, none of this is new, but every generation and every society has to consistently keep fighting that because power is always going to usurp more power. I know it sounds depressing, but it also gives us roadmaps of how people fought and won. It gives us roadmaps of liberations that have happened. It has given us a roadmap of what an organized, unified resistance can do. So that is how I would think about that.
So first of all, I would like to say that I appreciate the book. And although I haven't read it, I have ordered it and I plan on reading it. And it's nice that you documented what you've seen and you're believing based on what you've seen. But one thing I've had trouble with is allyship. So we're saying that what the system wants is providing for one sort of Hindu, like what the government was is providing for one sort of Hindu. It's privileging the one sort of Hindu over others. And also, when I'd studied in school, we had students from different parts of India. So in one of my friends, she was from Karnataka, and their families were a staunch believer of this ideology. And
Which ideology?
the
Hindutva
RSS.
or RSS? Okay.
Yeah. So the thing is, whenever I would bring up certain issues that were going on and some lynchings because of beef or anything that had to do with the Muslim community, she would say, she would insinuate that she knew what was happening, but then she would try to divert or digress from the issue at hand and say that let's not talk politics. But then she gave off the vibe that she knew what was happening, and then she was also shut off from certain things. Like they were so adamant on believing what they believe is right. So keeping that group aside, there are also like other groups from your community or like from the Hindu community that needs to stay in solidarity and have allyship with those who are struggling in this land. When it comes to solidarity, recently we've seen Muslim women being auctioned off on apps. And we've seen this lady who photoshopped her face onto the app screenshots, and then she's calling it solidarity. So how do we convince all of these people to stand with us and to stand with the people in this land who are being oppressed and marginalized? And how do we convince them to join the fight? As you've put out that we need to be on the streets, how do we? A lot of them are still denying that there is that there are stuff that is happening right now, and a lot of them are still hesitant to talk about what's happening and to actually join the fight.
Okay, to start with, the person who did it, her name is Vidyut. She's an idiot. Behavior like that, please, I don't want to sugarcoat it. It's the most inconsiderate, performative, cloud-chasing bullshit. And it's not the job of you or any of the Muslim women who were already traumatized to go tell these women to shut up. It's my job. And I did tell them to shut up. And that is what we need to do. I don't think the burden of resistance is on you. It should not be on you. It's not your job to convince morons that you deserve dignity. That is not your fight. That is my fight, along with many things. Allyship is complicated. But allyship begins with me saying, what do you want? Sometimes you can tell me, Suchitra, I want you to do this. And I need to tell you, yes, I can, or yes, I can't. If I say I can't, then you can go and figure out what you want to do. And sometimes you can tell me, Suchitra, I need you to shut up and sit in the corner. I need to shut up and sit in the corner. Sometimes I might need to step up and put my body in the line. It's very important. All of the time, allyship is always a constant conversation. And I think it's important that we decide who we are supposed to be in conversation with. Right? So I think that's the first thing. I will not and will never claim to speak for Muslim women, even if my best friend is one, even if I have women in my family who are there because of interfaith marriages, because some of my professors are, some of the people who are responsible for where I am today, whether it is Atarzia or Mona or any of these women, Kashmiri women who are instrumental in this book. It is not my job to tell them what to do, it's my job to listen. I think listening has always been the problem of the majority. Because we have always been told that it's our job to lead, that we have to take the center stage. So that is a learning process. So I will talk to you about what I can do. I have not believed in God, at least the Hindu God, for a very long time. But that does not mean that I can shed my Hindu identity today. Being a secular or an atheist or an antagonist, agnostic,
I could choose, because faith is a matter of what happens between me and whoever is there. So even as someone like me who has had a very difficult relationship with my religion, I cannot today not identify as a Hindu because I am born a Hindu in this country. And being born a Hindu to an upper caste father gives me immense privilege of caste and class. I cannot deny that. And I think it's very important for us to begin that conversation with many of us understanding what our privileges are. It's very important. Now, the second question is, even acknowledging privilege has now become a performative act. So much of performative social media today is saying, oh, I am so privileged, I'm going to be an ally. What have I achieved today by openly disclosing to all of you here that I'm privileged? Has it changed your material condition? No. What will change your material condition is if there is an action for us to work together and somehow I can bring my resources, physical, political, emotional, financial, to that battle. So your ally is someone who can give you all of this or some of this most of the time. Now, there are some very problematic people within this fight that I do not agree with. I have my red lines with people that I will never work with. I will not work with some of those people. That is my red line. But then there are some problematic people who I do not agree with, but I have no choice because we are fighting a fascist. So those are the red lines that I will have to put for myself as moral political clarity. But always in consultation with the community I claim to be in solidarity with. But all of this is so much work. It's incredible work. It's easy to say I'm in solidarity with you on Twitter. It's going to take me 45 seconds or less. All of these other things takes a lot more. The people who do all of this consistently is a small number. What I can do is to try and make sure that I do this, and I keep trying to convert more people into this belief that we need to do more than says not in my name. What does not in my name mean? So I think it's a difficult conversation. It's a conversation one has to consistently have. And it's also about, at some point in time, upper caste, upper class, Hindus of all extraction, religious, secular, atheist, whatever, saying that they are not the center stage. And that's very difficult. We live in a performance economy where your clout is based on how much airtime someone gives you. So it is a long process, but this is not your job. Telling people like Vidyut to shut up is not your job. It's my job. And you shouldn't be put in the position where you're not only fighting a system that is consistently dehumanizing you, but also educate someone who claims to be an ally who is causing you more damage. What kind of violence is that? And this is not the first time people like this have done this. Rohini Singh, I think, coined the word called Musangi, right? Imagine how violent that word is. When you know that India is a Hindu majority country and you have a systematic, consistent ways to demonize a community, and you are saying that people who disagree with you are the same as a majority community. A Sangi and a Musangi can never be same. And yet, this is the narrative that is being peddled. But these are not the allies that one wants. I would never work with those. So that is my red line. Right? I will never work with people whose ideological clarity is to their own power. So that allyship conversation is long, it's complicated, it's messy. But more importantly, I think people like me should learn to hear that sometimes, maybe most of the times, we are wrong. If that doesn't happen, I think there is no allyship. I think you will be better off without allies who cause you more trauma.
Thank you, ma'am. Does anyone have any other questions?
Thank you, ma'am, for the time being. In response to the post-nationalism,
Sorry, I can't hear you. You have to speak up a little louder.
in response to the post-national question, you were mentioning about the COVID and the pandemic situation. So this doubt came into me, whether this pandemic or the COVID has made the nationalism or national state much stronger in terms of its restrictions, controls over the citizens. I think after the COVID, there has been a lot of discussions in the control and restrictions of nationalism. A companion has started that discussion, and long ago this discussion has been going on. Even Harari has also wrote about that, I think. So whether the pandemic makes nationalism as an idea, as well as its control over the citizens, especially into the minorities, whether it is making national states more controllable or more stronger.
So two things, right? So you have the two key concepts. One is disaster capitalism and other is terror capitalism. So disaster capitalism is when every time a disaster, a crisis is used by the state to usurp more power. We saw this in Katrina, we saw it after 9/11, we saw it after every crisis. It's very interesting that it was only after Kargil war that India starts issuing these border ID cards. So crisis is always used by the state. Crisis is always used by the state to expand its executive powers. That's always been the case. The Patriot Act is a key example. India's own anti-terror laws that came after 9/11 are examples of it. So a state is always going to use any kind of crisis to create a system of surveillance capitalism, right? That's always going to happen. Second is, I keep forgetting this. This is a book on China's digital and surveillance security of the Uyghur Muslim community. I think the book is, I think Darren Wells is the author. So he has now come up with the idea for something called terror capitalism, where terrorizing a community and destroying them is also a way of extracting capital out of them. So what you're right now seeing in India is both. I feel that you have terror capitalism where a certain kind of violence and surveillance is inflicted on a very specific community in order to extract capital. And you also have disaster capitalism where the system is going to, whether it's your surveillance apps, I think Hyderabad police, what they are doing is a very interesting case study on how they've used surveillance, how they are now stopping people without ID, how they are checking people's WhatsApp messages. So you're seeing both of this happen. So that is happening. But states will always do that. I think what we have to look at is how people are responding to it. And I think that is where the post-nation is beginning to happen, where people are beginning to circumvent that. So just as much as the government will try to expand its power, I think the people trying to circumvent it, I don't think anyone thinks of this as, oh, the post-nation is coming, we are planning for the post-nation. I think people are genuinely figuring out, how can I survive? How can I live better? How can I take care of the person next to me? And I think that is where the beginnings of the post-nation is already there, and it's already, that's what I meant by that.
I think we can take 2 more questions. Okay, so I have a question to ask. So yeah, so you've used, we've talked about this before. So you have used this phrase called, journalism as genocide. So can you explain it? Also, how did you come to the idea of police project? How was it formed?
Okay. So Journalism is Genocide is an essay that I wrote many, many years ago, which keeps having different afterlives. So, for those of you who don't know who I am, I actually began my career as a lawyer. I began as a young lawyer working for the War Crimes Tribunal for Yugoslavia and Rwanda. Both of these instances, and in Yugoslavia, I was a trial lawyer, and in Rwanda, I worked as a researcher and researcher for the judge. So I would help them draft the judgments. And both of my work gave me access to this huge archive of testimonies of people who had survived in case of Yugoslavia, balkanization, and then genocide, and in Rwanda, of course, the Tutsi genocide. And it's interesting to see how did these communities that were thriving societies, that were mixed, secular, plural, that had a long history of living together, then become destroyed literally within a period of 7 years. Yugoslavia was give and take 7 or 8 years. Rwanda, again, 4 to 6 years. And I had been collecting these testimonies, and I spent a lot of time in the Nuremberg archive, which was the Nuremberg laws, and also the Nuremberg tribunal is the one that really creates the precedent for how does one prosecute people for war crimes and genocide. And a lot of that work was shelved for a long time because I'm not a South Asianist by training. I'm not a scholar of South Asia. I'm a scholar of violence, and I'm a scholar of civil war and other things, but I'm not a scholar of South Asia, and I didn't really start working on South Asia until I started working on this book. When I started working on this book was also around the time in which everybody was convinced that Modi was going to come to power. And I was already seeing ways in which the media was beginning to champion a very specific narrative. Journalism as genocide comes from a judgment from the tribunal in Rwanda. So I worked on the Simon Bikindi case, where Simon Bikindi was a pop singer in Rwanda who was charged with incitement of genocide. It's a very fascinating case because for the first time in the history, they were charging a pop star, a singer whose songs were played in Radio Rwanda throughout, for inciting genocide. And along with it, there were also testimonies of journalists who had seen, reporters who had seen what journalists in Rwanda did in order to make this possible. Whether as Radio Rwanda broadcasts, whether reporting, whether very clearly creating the communal things. And I kind of started seeing something very similar happening in India, and what I did was I went back to my archives and I started looking at patterns between the Nuremberg tribunals, the Nuremberg tribunal archives of what happened in Nazi Germany, Yugoslavia, and Rwanda. And over a period of a year, it became very clear that there was a very specific pattern, and journalists were very much part of the priming process. So I used the phrase from the judgment, journalism as genocide, to talk about what journalists in India are doing, and how just as Nazi Germany, just as Rwanda, just as Der Sturm, just as other Rwandan newspapers, how Indian journalists were similarly creating conditions for a genocide. If not genocide, at least a certain form of balkanization. I think I wrote this in 2014. But for every few years, people discover it, and it just it goes viral. I think you all discovered again now. So I think it's being rediscovered for the third time now. So that's the essay. So the essay basically lays out the historical background of it, and I also used the phrase democratic alibi and expanded its definition to explain how these journalists were giving excuses. A democratic alibi gives you reasons to kill someone, lynch someone, murder someone, occupy Kashmir. So these were the two key concepts that went into the essay. I didn't want to submit this to an academic journal because I really didn't see the point of 4 people. So academics here will realize that if you write for an academic journal, 4 people will read it. If you're lucky, 4 people will read it. So I wrote it for a general audience, and that is what is. And basically it looks at what all has happened and the signposts of what happened. So in 2013, I had a bunch of things that I said were going to happen. I think all of it has already happened, and that's the essay. Polis project started for a long time. A lot of us were just feeling that research had become so ossified, that we were all researching things. There was so much critical knowledge that was not reaching the larger audience. People were writing for each other. Similarly, journalism was getting gutted, and I kept saying that we need to bring together journalism, in-depth research, and long-form journalism to write about communities in resistance. When I had this idea in 2015, people said you can't have resistance in an organization, nobody will give you money, which is very true, nobody gave us money. By 2016, Modi's regime was already poised. I knew by 2016 that Modi was coming back to power. Erdogan was in power in Turkey, Trump won. And it felt that this was the time to create an institution that would do this. So I went to two of my dear friends, Asim Rafiki and Francesca Recchi, and I said, we should build this as a collective. Can we do this together? I'm also much younger and much more inexperienced and overall just all over the place than both Francesca and Asim. And I'm still surprised that they both said, yes, we should do this. And that's how Polis Project was born. 8th of Jan, we started in 2017, we incorporated in 2018. So I think depending on what the birthday is, we either turn 4 or 5 this January 8th. So that's what Polis Project does.